In my still as yet relatively short parliamentary career, it has been necessary for me to address this dark subject of legalized, medically facilitated killing well over a dozen times. When I was elected 8 years ago, it was not legal under any circumstance for a doctor to kill or assist in the killing of a patient. Prior to that time, when this issue had been brought to the House of Commons, proposals for the legalization of this sort of killing had been defeated by massive margins, with a majority of Conservatives, Liberals, and New Democrats opposing such changes, just 8 short years ago. I recall as a young Conservative staffer in 2009, hearing and reflecting on the wise words of former NDP MP Joe Coe-Martin, who told the House the following on October the 2nd of that year. He said, "I have spoken to Carol Derbyshire, who is the head of the hospice. She said the hospice does not get requests for assisted suicide. They provide the care not just to the patient but to the family. She was very clear on that. She has seen any number of surveys that say one of the major reasons, aside from pain, that people want assisted suicide in their regime is that they do not want to be a burden on their family, their society, their community. If we can build that system to make sure they do not have to be concerned about that, we take away any desire to terminate their lives arbitrarily and at an earlier date than would be natural. We need to look at our system right now. At this point, approximately 20% of our population is covered by meaningful palliative care, hospice, and a home care system. That is all we have in the country. Then there is another 15% or maybe 17% who are covered by partial assistance at the end of life. This former NDP MP foresaw how requests for premature death would emerge not primarily from some fixed and deeply held desire to die, but from a social, cultural, and political context in which people in pain are either invited to stay or invited to leave, and in which people are either offered the support to stay or not. We are all social beings, and our exercise of autonomy happens in a social context. And the current social context is one of increasing atomization and division, economic failures leading to immense affordability challenges, and a kind of moral chaos resulting from the common lack of constructive frameworks for finding meaning and purpose in life. The touchstones of connection, happiness, and meaning are eroding. This leads to an increasing demand for government services that will, it is hoped, fill the gap left by declining community and family and provide people with support in finding connection, happiness, and meaning when they are lacking. And as these supports are never available from the state in ways that truly fulfill the desire for connection and community that we all have, the pain increases and leads more and more people to want to give up. This has been the trajectory of our society recently, with the additional reality that COVID-era restrictions and polarization accelerated the breakdown of connection and community among many people. So as more and more people want to give up, the legalization of medically facilitated death is presented as a solution at the end of the road. And as over the last 8 years, more and more people have gotten to the end of that road, the numbers continue to go up exponentially. This is the social context driving the mental health crisis we have, to which euthanasia is now being offered as a solution. In the speech from MP Coe-Martin that I referred to, he also observed how a lack of proper training and emphasis on effective pain management meant that existing tools and technologies were not being deployed to relieve pain, even in the many cases where such relief was possible. He predicted, again correctly, that the legalization of euthanasia would lead to less attention to pain relief, thus further tilting the decision-making playing field away from life and towards death. And that is exactly what we are seeing. John Paul II posited in the 1990s that, quote, "The reality is characterized by the emergence of a culture which denies solidarity and in many cases takes the form of a veritable culture of death. This culture is actively fostered by powerful cultural, economic, and political currents which encourage an idea of society excessively concerned with efficiency. Looking at the situation from this point of view, it is possible to speak in a certain sense of a war of the powerful against the weak. A life which would require greater acceptance, love, and care is considered useless, as held to be an intolerable burden, and is therefore rejected in one way or another. A person who, because of illness, handicap, or more simply, just by existing, compromises the well-being or lifestyle of those who are more favored tends to be looked upon as an enemy to be resisted or eliminated. In this way, a kind of conspiracy against life is unleashed. This conspiracy involves not only individuals and their personal, family, or group relationships, but goes far beyond to the point of damaging and distorting, at the international level, relations between peoples and states." Madam Speaker, 8 years on, we are sadly seeing the flower of this predicted culture of death. We hear proposals for the killing of children, even babies, and for the killing of those with depression and other mental health challenges. We have heard many testimonies of people who have been called selfish for wanting to remain alive in a situation where they require the care and support of others. We are seeing the lives of those with disabilities, those facing homelessness, and others facing pain and suffering devalued at the social, institutional, and political level. We see the manifestations of this war of the powerful against the weak, insofar as suicide prevention is offered to some, while suicide facilitation is offered to others, depending on pre-existing power and privilege. Proponents of euthanasia have never said that all people who want to die should be able to choose to die. Rather, they have said that certain kinds of people should be helped to die, while other kinds of people should be helped to live. This differential treatment of different people necessarily informs the social context in which people feel loved, included, and happy, or not. Madam Speaker, 8 years on, Canada's experiment with medically facilitated killing has failed. I will leave it to another time to consider whether or not it could have succeeded. Some will argue that it would have been possible to legalize euthanasia without unleashing the kind of ever-expanding culture of death that we see proposed. But what is clear, at least in the context of our own experience, is that medically facilitated killing has taken on a kind of self-reinforcing logic that leads to constant expansion, a devaluing of the lives of the most vulnerable, and eroding public and community support for the things that would actually improve the quality of life of those who suffer. One effect of this culture of death is that people in vulnerable situations actually fear interactions with the medical system because they don't want to be pressured towards suicide in a moment of weakness or vulnerability. I have specifically heard this concern, even now, from people facing acute mental pain, that they do not want to seek help in many contexts because they are looking for life and dignity-affirming help, and they are afraid that the so-called care that they might receive would take the form of pressuring them towards an early exit. And this is part of the reason why conservatives support the protection of conscience for individual medical practitioners and institutions, not just for the sake of the provider, but for the sake of the patient, who should at least have the freedom to opt to access health care in a life and dignity-affirming environment, where they can be confident that they will not be pressured or even offered premature death. Understandably, many of those who are in a vulnerable state do not wish to even be offered such things, since the affirmation of life and meaning is an essential part of the proper course of treatment for those facing mental health challenges. After 8 years, it is important that we stop and take stock of how much has changed, lest we forget that political choices have profound consequences, and also that political choices, once made, can still be at least partially unmade. I am reminded of this every time I talk to a legislator in another country about Canada's euthanasia regime. Legislators in other Western democratic countries, including many from the left, are for the most part horrified by the present reality of euthanasia in Canada. One British legislator told their House of Commons the following: "Turning to the example of Canada across the pond, Living and Dying Well also found that clinicians report 5 specific issues surrounding legislation, including that it complicates the management of pre-existing symptoms, adversely impacts the important doctor-patient relationship, causes tension for families during which is often an already deeply challenging period, diverts resources away from crucial palliative care services, and confuses patients as to the nature and purpose of palliative care. When considered as a whole, those issues reported by practicing clinicians in Canada are not something that we as lawmakers can or should overlook, and I believe that the highlighted impacts on palliative care provision are of particular concern." Madam Speaker, why aren't concerns about Canada's emergent culture of death as well known or discussed in the Canadian House of Commons or in Canadian society as they are in the British House of Commons or other countries? And here I do want to point the finger specifically at our state-funded media, the CBC. I am most enthusiastic about our conservative commitment to defund the CBC because of the shameless way that this organization uses its funded and privileged position to push stories that glorify euthanasia while ignoring the pain and suffering of those whose experience the CBC does not want to share. Good ideas win fair debates, and my constituents should not be forced to give over $1 billion every year to an organization which desperately hunts for stories aimed at masking the dark realities of medically facilitated killing and suicide. Madam Speaker, Canada was not this way 8 years ago, and fortunately Canada will not be this way forever. The end of this fanatically pro-euthanasia, pro-death government is now more than reasonably foreseeable. A Conservative government will forever dispense with this lingering proposed legalization of medically facilitated suicide for those with mental health challenges. We will turn hurt into hope. We will stand with the most vulnerable and work to revive the structures of family and community that advance connection, happiness, and meaning. We will celebrate life instead of death for all, not just for the privileged. For nations nations and for people, there is always hope. For the wretched of the earth, there is a flame that never dies. Even the darkest night will end and the sun will rise.
Hear, hear.